Welcome back to Trust the Science.
Episode 5. So today's going to be a little bit different. We're kind of taking a break from our regularly scheduled programming, talking about vaccines. We will get back to it, but we just want to explore something a little different for this episode. I'm going to talk about a very, unknown character, I'd say, generally speaking, in history, but a very interesting one nonetheless. I call this episode The Ballad of Eben Byers. Be sure to drink your Radithor. I don't know if you know what Radithor is, or if you ever heard of the name Eben Byers before.
No, I've heard of neither.
Yeah, well, to be fair, neither had I until like a week ago. This kind of came up on one of my random searches somewhere, and I got interested in it. So this one's going to be a little bit different. It's more of a narrative, but I think you'll see that it does have some of the same kind of story points as our previous conversations, although, different context. Generally, we're going to, talk about health-related things and how science sometimes can have implications there, but sometimes it's lagging behind like the mainstream thought processes on things, and this is a pretty good example of that. So feel free to stop me at any time, but I'm kind of just going to go through this guy's life and some of the relevant details of that era, explaining, the phenomenon of Radithor and why it's kind of an interesting story. So Eben Byers, he was the son of an industrialist. He was born in the late 1800s, and he was kind of a local celebrity out of the Pittsburgh area. And where we kind of start paying attention to him is a little bit later in his life. But the reason why he was a celebrity of sorts is because he was actually a well-known amateur golfer. Golf was like a pretty big deal back then. And he had actually won like the Amateur U.S. Open in 1906. He had qualified for it several other times. He was a golfer at Yale back in the day, where he graduated from. But so he was well known. He was kind of like a ladies' man too in the local area. People knew of him. And actually, although he was kind of well known in Pittsburgh, his fame, spread further than that. He was kind of a household name in other parts of the country too.
What time?
This was in like the early 20th century. We're talking like the 1910s to the early 30s. And so, again, where we kind of pick up on his story is more in the late 20s, 1927 to be specific. He was 47 years old by then. So he's kind of in those like later years. It's not old by modern standards, but at that time, like 47 was kind of different. You were considered to be pretty old, but he was still pretty active, still kind of this like rambunctious sort that didn't really act his age, so to speak. Anyways, he was riding on a railway train on his way home from a Yale versus Harvard football game, which was his alma mater, and he was sleeping on the top bunk of this like sleeping berth. And he fell off, and he landed on his arm, and he injured it pretty badly. And so at first, not really a big deal, but over the next several weeks, he started to complain of persistent arm pain associated with the fall. Seeing as he was a pretty active person, he was an avid golfer, he was kind of inclined to try to find any way to make this go away as quick as possible, as most of us probably would. But I couldn't find specifics on whether or not it was like a broken arm or anything, but bad enough where he went to the doctor at least. So
yeah, all I could find was that he heard it, but it didn't really say if it was broken or not.
Yeah,
maybe they didn't even know if it was broken back then.
I mean, it could have been not like standard practice to do x-rays and stuff like that. I don't know. Anyway, so coming from like a wealthy family, they had like their own personal like physician that they trusted. His name was CC Moyer. And so he goes to this physician, He asks him, is there anything that you can do to help me? And this guy prescribes him a concoction known as Radithor, which, again, like, what the heck is that? This sounds really crazy, right? When I typed it in Google, it actually was like, hey, do you mean radiator? It's like, nah. But the name will make a little more sense when we talk about it in a greater context in a minute. But essentially, Radithor was this patent-pending medicine developed by a man named William Bailey, which he claimed to be essentially like making these magical medicinal tonics and products that would cure a wide range of ailments, including pain, hypertension, depression, even like impotence.
Oh, it's one of those, snake venom cocktails. Like,
kind of, yeah. He was like a charlatan, essentially. But, so he had developed like a lengthy list of these products. All of them contained radium. So they're radium-based products. He had everything from like hair tonic to pain-relieving creams that you'd be rubbing on your afflicted areas, like on your skin. Even like ones specific to your mouth and gums and stuff like that.
Radium jaw.
Yeah, there's all this products, and I'm thinking about this like as we now know. For those of you who don't, radium's like radioactive, like very radioactive, very toxic, very dangerous. And just to think like this guy is basically saying, yeah, rub it all over you. It's going to heal you. It will end your pain eventually, but not before going through a tremendous amount of other pain probably. And so, unbeknownst to the general public, especially to this unfortunate Byers fella, Bailey was not actually an MD, although he claimed to be. He touted himself as an MD, but in reality, he was a Harvard University dropout, falsely claiming to be a doctor. And his kind of idea behind these products was that he suggested they stimulated the endocrine system, which had these beneficial health effects, boosted people's energy and immune systems and all these things. But in reality, the truth was like way more sinister. The only problem is the general public wasn't really well informed. And so this is a really good example of people either who are informed or not. I don't actually know if Bailey, according to later interviews, he was adamant that his products were legit.
Did he not take them?
No, he did. And he actually eventually died from radiation poisoning as well. But he never stopped believing in his products. So whether he openly knew it or not, these were not safe, but he never seemingly, came clean if he knew that they weren't safe. So, in any case, Bailey wasn't the only person doing this, by the way. In the early 20th century, there was actually a boom of sales of products touted to be miraculous health benefits. And it's not only, Radithor. This is all over the board. But for whatever reason, radium became like very, very popular. During this era, the Food and Drug Administration was kind of in its infancy. And because radium was considered a natural element, it didn't feel the need to oversee it.
Yeah. Well, radium was just discovered like 20 years earlier in 1898.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was kind of like a new element, and
it's fairly new, and it was being studied pretty like, I guess, adamantly, but not all those studies were made public. And think about the era too, where information wasn't like readily available, and even I would imagine most people didn't have time to care about that kind of thing. Heck, I would speculate that most people probably couldn't even read a lot of those like scientific papers or come out with meaning of it. It's basically they have advertising is their like primary source of information.
Yeah, newspapers and
if you see an advertising, unfortunately, you're gonna probably kind of believe it. And so if you see enough of it, why would you think, it's kind of like cigarettes where everyone's like, all the cigarette companies aren't saying this is dangerous. They're saying it's fine.
Yeah.
Why would you think else?
Especially when the effects are like 10, 15, 40 years down the road.
Yeah. They can be, years down the road, up, like you said, up to like 40 years. So it kind of depends on how much you ingest or are exposed to. But in any case, FDA wasn't really doing anything over it. So during this time, numerous companies and opportunists began marketing products, various devices that allowed consumers to, quote unquote, enjoy the supposed health benefits of radium. And yes, as I mentioned, that is that radium, the one that sounds very similar to the word radioactive. And that's for good reason, right? It's became known as a radioactive element. So I guess one of the interesting kind of side notes, I was looking into it. So radium products actually were pretty pricey. As you mentioned, radium had been first kind of discovered in 1898 by Madame Curie.
Marie Curie.
And her husband. And later she actually received like multiple Nobel Prizes for her, finding of radium and also determining how to purify it and things like that. She did a lot of work with it. But around this was a projected value for pure radium in 1910. So 1 gram of pure radium was thought to have cost somewhere in the order of $120,000.
Dang.
That is in 1910, 1915 money. How much do you think that is now?
I don't even know, man. Pre-2020, it was probably... Are we talking pre-2020 or?
I don't know. This was just the number I found. I didn't actually verify the date that they were coming up with this, but it was about 2.2 million. So 1 gram of this stuff is worth like 2.2 million. So you can imagine if that's the case, these products, they're not using like a crazy amount, but they're still pricey.
Right.
To put that in perspective, this like Radithor drink that Byers was drinking was about $15, which think about your like classic energy drink or cup of coffee. You're probably on the order of a few bucks, maybe $5. Like $15, I'm not buying that shit.
Well, that's $15 back in 1920, and that's like...
yeah, and that's a lot. It's a lot. Like, I don't know the exact conversion, but that's quite a bit. So yeah, it's a good point too. It's even more than that. So even though it was really expensive, this didn't stop the manufacturers or zealous buyers from really demanding these very popular products. And the reason why they're popular, again, is because they've been touted to have these magical, health benefits, right? So in the era from like the mid-teens through the early 30s, you had this huge blow up of different devices and products. There's one device known as, I think it's called Revigators, Revigators. So Revigators that were sold under the premise of enhancing your family drinking water with radon. So radon is different than radium. It's a noble gas, but is a decomposition product of radium, and it's still really toxic. What these things consisted of essentially are like a ceramic pot containing radium ore or straight up radium.
Yeah, I was saying $15 in 1920s money is roughly $400 today.
Wow. Yeah.
For a drink.
This wasn't like...
This dude had to have had...
He was wealthy, but he would buy it by the case too. Crazy. Yeah. Anyhow, so these ceramic pots contain radium ore or straight up radium. And so you would put your... it's like a Brita. Think like Brita with radium in it. You put it in your fridge. I don't even know if they had fridges back then, but you put it like where you have your water coming out. You were supposed to drink like 5-6 glasses of this a day. That's what they said. And you're drinking like radon-infused water, which they didn't think anything of it. They thought it was great for you, but that's probably not very great for you. So keep in mind, like, now we know that radon is essentially a gas that is created from the decay of radium and that is known to have many associated health risks and negative health impacts, including cancer. This is now like kind of evident. Like, I learned about this when I did like construction or
radon.
Yeah, radon, because you would worry about with like old buildings. Sometimes they have like sensors in them, sometimes they don't. But essentially, like, radon can like off gas from the soil, and if it accumulates in a certain area, it's like really toxic. So if you have radon exposure in an old building or something, it's a big problem, and it can have, you know, environmental impacts, health issues, all that. So in any case, like, you're basically openly drinking poison and marketing it, and people are like, yeah, this is amazing, I feel wonderful, you know. So yeah, drinking radium water essentially became like all the rage. Numerous products were also sold containing radium for other benefits and cosmetic effects. So it wasn't just like health benefits, it was cosmetic too. This included radium-infused cigarettes.
Of course.
So like you're literally like volatilizing it and breathing it in, which very, very awesome for your health, on top of just being cigarettes. And horrifyingly, this one will get you, radium-containing condoms.
Really?
They were meant to help with impotence and increase male arousal.
That's how you know it's just like some quack science.
Yeah, right. They actually refer to this era as radium quackery.
If it's in dick pills, it's like, you know that it's not.
But like, imagine being that poor bastard who was like the one guy who was like, oh, I'm gonna show me my lady some love, and put on a radium condom, and like a couple years later his dick falls off, you know, like he was like, oh, what the hell, how did that happen? I mean, good God. And don't forget, like, there was opportunists out there looking at the ladies too. It wasn't just this like male stuff. So for women, they marketed radium suppositories that were suggested to be used both anally and vaginally for, like, you know, nasty. Yeah, arousal purposes. And I'm just like, oh Lord, oh no, this shouldn't go in your body, and yet we're putting it on or in like our most sensitive areas. So there was even like luxurious hotels and spas that were popping up in various parts of the country where attendees could bathe in radium-infused springs.
We should talk about why radium captured people's interest, though, too.
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit when I talk about like Marie Curie and her discovery of it, because that's kind of a big deal,
right? Because like, why are all of a sudden these people thinking that,
right,
you know, we smoking cigarettes, using condoms, having suppositories? I feel like that's a big ask.
Yeah, I mean, like, where does it come from? But this is like, for the layman, it came from nowhere. Yeah, like, really, it's just these advertisements are like, bam, you know, and people who are making these products, they kind of took a loose understanding of science at the time and made it largely exaggerated, right? And so just to kind of, I guess, get on with the rest of the kind of fun facts, there's another, it wasn't just Radithor or William Bailey. There's like several companies. One brand name was called Thoradia, so it's literally just like Radithor backwards. And it was a company that produced skin creams, toothpaste, and soaps containing both radium and thorium, which is why I think that guy called it Radithor, because it has radium, although Radithor didn't have thorium in it, but it was like both were kind of touted at the same time to have similar effects. So thorium, which is another radioactive element.
I don't even know if I've heard of thorium.
Yeah, so Thoradia was kind of the competitor, right? And both became very lucrative and pretty commonplace, like all these products. And essentially there became like a cosmetic boom, right? These products were marketed to provide an unnatural and appealing glow, which perhaps all too coincidentally was very true, as radium itself was known to glow like bluish green. and had been utilized for these properties in production of various products, notably watches and clocks. So people had been doing that as like using it as a paint. And so this is where we kind of go into another very interesting story as a side note. Like, it's kind of this idea, the part about it like glowing, that ultimately was one of the reasons that could like contributed to the demise of use in products. And you may have heard of this. I think most people have probably heard it at a passing glance. But in the late 1920s, there were women working in several factories that employed the use of radium paints on watches and clock faces. They basically paint it to make the numbers and things on them glow.
Yeah, they're called the Radium Girls.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's factories all over the country, and many of these women started becoming gravely ill due to extensive exposure to radium. And this phenomenon really began when workers started in 1917 accidentally ingesting and inadvertently exposing themselves because they would lick the paintbrushes that they would use to draw these numbers on these like little watches and clocks, because they're trying to narrow the paintbrush to make it like a finer, more precise movement. And so, having been told that there was no safety dangers, like the people in charge were like, there are no safety dangers. They're like Bill Clinton over here lying to your face. Yeah. Like, I do not have. But the reality, unfortunately, is that people were already kind of aware that there were. So these people were straight up lying. Anyhow, so these women became known, as you said, as the Radium Girls. They would even sometimes like entertain themselves by taking turns using the paint to illuminate their eyebrows. So they put it on their face.
Yeah.
They'd like paint it on their eyebrows, put it on their lips like lipstick, even put it on their teeth, and like go in dark rooms and like make faces at each other.
Yeah. I mean, especially if you don't think there's anything wrong.
You're like, oh, this is
kind of
cool. Yeah. And
right?
like this wasn't the only place that this kind of idea was put. Like, people put in jewelry, like necklaces and like face creams and stuff, and it was cool. Like, it glowed. Not knowing that glow is actually evidence of like a very, very radioactive and deadly, toxic process. So, unfortunately for these women, though, like I mentioned, chemists and scientists that were involved in the purification of radium had long employed safety measures to protect themselves against radioactive exposure. Like, they were well aware of it. They would use like lead screens, special tongs, and masks to mitigate particle inhalation. This information, though, is not presented to them. It was not only withheld, but actively lied about. So it was basically a giant cover-up. They're like, don't worry. Just do your job.
Yeah.
And as a result, numerous suspicious workplace injuries started to occur, some of which led to deaths. Women were seen to have a variety of complications, starting with like anemia, which isn't great, but not like super alarming at first. But this transpired into like sores, burns, and ultimately like bone cancer.
Right. Well, their nose would fall off, their jaws would fall off, they would just get deformed.
It was, if you've seen some of the pictures, it's like fucking horrendous.
Yeah, pretty nasty.
Eventually, over a decade later, these workers were able to sue and litigate for compensation for the unlawful and neglectful workplace exposure. But this part kind of blew my mind. The payouts were insultingly low, accounting for as little as $170,000 per person.
Is that in that money or today's money?
I think that's in that, like, today's money. Like, it's been made up for in today's money. So $170,000 isn't really that much. No. And that's accounting for inflation. I think I put that in my notes. And so, in addition, they were like, okay, we'll give you, accounting for inflation, an additional $10,000 per year for every year that you're still alive.
Nice.
Which is like, how generous of you. To give you context on that, their lives were like tragically short. Most of these women actually died before their cases were even settled.
Okay, yeah, so it's $10,000 in 1928 money, $150,000 today, and then they would get approximately $600 per year.
Yeah.
In 1920s money, but about
like
$10,000.
So that's like basically nothing, you know. And when we talk about lawsuits nowadays, especially against like big corporations, stuff, they're paying out like millions or billions.
Yeah.
So this was kind of interesting because I think it is one of the first times there was like a public outcry that led to like a corporation actually having to take responsibility. But when you think about it, that was kind of like a slap on the wrist. It wasn't anything that substantial, and these people were killed, and that was just for like a small subset. You know, there was hundreds of workers. This was like it was 5. Yeah, like 5 women, and the rest of them got nothing. They just died. So
with messed up
bodies. It's pretty terrible. So it was around this time that, you know, the public became kind of attentive of there being an issue here, and ultimately did lead to change with the removal of radium from everyday products, and also the creation of laws that protect workers' health in general. The FDA, as we talked about before, also started to employ regulations, I think in 1938, for food and cosmetics, where radium was to be limited. But they didn't outrightly end the use of radium universally. It was continued to be used in certain military applications, still within dials and clocks and on instrumentation panels of airplanes for like years to come, which is kind of disturbing. Like there's actually a couple stories about these like people in World War II. They were, I want to say, like ranked officers, and in Normandy when they invaded on D-Day, some of them had this like coin that they put on the top of their helmets, and it had radium like here as a circular coin. And so at night, the way that you would be able to tell someone's walking up on you but it was a friendly is because they'd have a glowing dot on their forehead. But apparently that wasn't like a widely distributed thing. There's only like several known to still exist. But they were monitoring radiation levels, and even that was 1944. Even now, it's like very toxic. They keep it in these like closed jars, like sealed in a vault.
Not as toxic as a bullet, though.
yeah, that's very true. I mean, they did save that guy from getting shot by his friend. So
yeah.
So now we'll take a step back. As you mentioned, like why did all these people think radium was such a great thing if in hindsight clearly it was killing these people, right?
Yeah.
So as we mentioned several times, it was discovered in 1898 by Marie Curie and her husband Pierre. They were investigating like uranium ore at the time, and actually in that uranium ore is where they found trace amounts of radium, because it's a decay product from uranium. And so they found it then. Upon their discovery, they, as well as many other scientists, became like really interested, because they were like able to determine it's emitting some sort of radioactive properties. Like they had these, I guess they call them like photo screens, where they would actually see like imprints on these screens, which allowed them to know that something is like emanating from it. And at that point, they just knew it as like radiation. They didn't know as extensively as we know now, but they already had a pretty good understanding of how it could be applied. So people became interested in it as a potential application to treat various afflictions, most notably cancer. Actually, I found this very fascinating, because we now, like radiation, right? That's kind of a layman term that we use nowadays. That's been around for a while as a form of anti-cancer treatment.
Yeah, cancer therapy, radiation therapy.
It's very harsh, but it can be effective, but with bad side effects, because most radiation, if not all radiation, is typically not great for you. But it's crazy to me that even that long ago, over 120 years ago, people were already like, hey, we could use this to treat cancer. I had no idea. I thought that was like a 1950s, 1960s thing, but it was quite some time ago. So, in fact, radium was eventually used for the treatment of cancer and was found to be useful at killing cancer cells. However, in a twist of irony, it also kills non-cancerous cells indiscriminately, which affords its very toxic reputation and can, like I said, ironically, while treating cancer, also cause a number of different cancers, particularly liver, breast, and most infamously, bone cancer. So while these phenomena are kind of well understood today, it was pretty widely debated in the early 20th century for like decades. Some people were like, no, radium's not good for you, and others clearly were not as convinced. Scientists and doctors alike saw it as a potential miracle-like, application. And so lots of people kind of jumped to perform studies on clinical use for treating different things. I found a couple. So people used it to try to treat rheumatism, which I'm pretty sure is like a form of arthritis caused by the immune system. Gout, which is another kind of autoimmune thing. Even diabetes, which is debatably autoimmune as well. One of the other applications was for like depression. And one of the other than cancer, people really excited about using it as a potential for tuberculosis.
One of the big ones I saw was neuritis, inflammation of nerves, or
that was on there too.
Fibromyalgia today.
But tuberculosis too, was a big thing at that time, and they actually stumbled across the idea that it was toxic to bacteria, which isn't terribly surprising, right? If it's toxic to larger organisms, it's probably going to obliterate smaller organisms too. But they're like, oh, we're going to use it to treat tuberculosis. And so there was a lot of actual, at least in theory, potential for this to be a good thing. And I think that's where it all starts. Kind of this ideology that, hey, these scientists and doctors think this is legit. And so I'm going to jump on this bandwagon and kind of just use that and tout it out in the normal world, where in the background these people are doing these experiments, and before too long they start to see oh, it's actually not that great, but by then the genie's out of the bottle.
Yeah.
Right? People are already oh, I heard that this thing is a miracle drug, and we've seen this kind of in other circumstances throughout history too, where you really have to hey guys, actually the data is kind of not great here.
Well, that's one of the dangers with working with new drugs or anything chemistry, biology related. Is it's new, you don't know what it does. Maybe it does help and cure. Maybe it just does kill. Maybe it just kills you.
Yeah,
I feel like most new things, they just end up killing you. It's hard to make the human body better. It's a lot easier to make it worse.
And I think we've come a long ways too in clinical trials, where
showing the efficacy.
You're doing these in very small quantities with people who kind of have no other option. It's that gamble, right? And it's similar in this circumstance. They were treating people then you didn't have any options for cancer really. So they're yeah, do your best, and it would actually just be horrifyingly terrible. But I get where they were coming from. They were trying to rush along though. And I think we've learned a little bit as a society on this, but clearly history does tend to repeat itself, because we had an incident which we've already kind of beat like a dead horse. But, sometimes you want there to be a solution so bad that you're willing to try things.
Yeah, you're desperate.
Yeah. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, medical benefits of the use of radium for various afflictions were eventually not supported by their patient outcomes. You might cure them of one tumor, but you cause them bone cancer and they die anyways, or radiation poison and they die anyways. So you might actually succeed at curing the affliction. A lot of times it was used for topical ointments for eczema, birthmarks, stuff like that. You'd be oh, treated your eczema, great, but now you're gonna die.
Yeah. So
it's had they known that beforehand, they'd probably be I'm good with the eczema, But so one of the interesting ones I found was there's a founding doctor at Johns Hopkins University who actually was one of the pioneers of the technique for using radium to treat cancer, which he was on the right track. Like, we eventually did use radium and other radioactive what are they called? Radiotides, I think. I can't remember.
I don't know.
To do that, to create radiation therapy. So he was like kind of on the right track, but it's very primitive, right? And so he treated a number of different patients. While some of their tumors were successfully treated, they would eventually die of radiation poison or radiation-induced cancer, bone cancer. And unfortunately, the list of his patients that met a terrible demise also included his own aunt. Mm. And shortly after attempting a radium-assisted surgical treatment for a tumor, she died due to radiation poison. So he was using like crazy high concentrations. Sometimes it would take, for like these other kinds of topical things, the Radithor, like you were saying, it could take like years of exposure, but he was using it in such like high quantities. He was basically like frying these people.
It's interesting that it could kill so quickly.
It's pretty scary. He eventually changed his approach, and he started using this idea of using radium capsules. So like think like a little capsule. He would embed it in the body near a known tumor.
Okay.
And around. And again, kind of ahead of his time, right? Because actually, as I found out, this is still used in one form or another, but we're not using radium anymore.
Right, yeah.
Like they use that actually though, strategy, as I read, into like the 50s. And actually there's a gal, I forget her name, it's like Henrietta, whoever the HeLa cell is named after. She was actually treated with a very similar process of this like radium capsule to treat her tumor. If you don't know what HeLa cells are, they're
Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah, Henrietta Lacks.
Did she just get, her family just got some money somewhat in the past couple years?
Yeah, kind of a big deal actually.
Right, because
it's a controversy. Yeah. Basically, her cell line became immortalized cells that are used by like almost every...
Right, because they just don't die. It was in the 50s that they used them, and they're still being used today, and it's like...
Yeah, and it was kind of unethical for them to do that. Didn't like ask her permission really, but so yeah, it's kind of a big deal that they actually went back and recognized her kind of unknown contribution. She probably didn't even know how big of a contribution she's made to science, but anyway, so that I thought that was kind of an interesting aside. So yeah, they use safer radioisotopes to do similar things nowadays. So this guy actually, I'm impressed by his ideas. Unfortunately, his work actually probably did far more damage to his patients than good, but sometimes that happens in the process of scientific innovation, medical innovation. So overall, despite marginal successes with radium therapies, the efficacy of radium within clinical settings became hotly debated and ultimately kind of frowned upon. And the use of radium treatment radium treatment for disease diminished over time. It didn't leave the medical realm entirely, though. So being utilized for diagnostic purposes, applications such as X-rays, so radiography for diagnosis of fractures and things like that. And later, in more modern times, I guess it was used in what are called radioactive tracers, which we've used kind of in some contexts, radioactive tracers in like my work in the labs, because it basically allows you to monitor molecules in biological systems. So that's kind of interesting, cool side note.
Radium, it says there's one treatment for cancer, and then it's just kind of research.
Right, currently?
Yeah. So while it didn't really prove to be super successful for medical purposes long term, this didn't stop non-medically inclined businessmen, including our old friend William Bailey, from capitalizing on the sale of the aforementioned products. And so let's now kind of finish our story of our old friend Eben Byers, what happened to him. So after his initial introduction to Radithor, this is, mind you, back in 1927,
Bailey's popular drink that was infused with a mixture of radium-226 and 228 basically made him become addicted to it. He basically got like this crazy buzz. He was like, I'm paraphrasing his quote and modernizing it, but he was basically like, yo, I feel yoked. Like, really? He thought he was like super strong and like
giving him a high, like speed.
Like crazy energy all the time. It was like kind of like the first energy drink or something. I don't know. Anyways, he was like super enthusiastic about this stuff. He drank 3 bottles a day. Buying them
$1,200.
Yeah, buying them by the case. And the case had like 30. Yeah, so this dude was dropping money. And he claimed the drink had healed not only his arm pain, but more, attributing effects such as increased energy to this like magical concoction. And he very outwardly expressed his appreciation for the drink. He even suggested his friends, relatives, lovers, like they should all use it. He's like handing this stuff out, like you gotta get on this. Kind of like, I imagine it being like the infomercials nowadays where you're like, hey, have you heard about this supplement? If you're not on it, you're missing out. It's basically that. To the point where like there's actually like a legend that he reportedly gave it to one of his beloved horses. Like it was like a racehorse, and he thought that was gonna like make him get up and go, So it was estimated that throughout his life, he drank over 1,500 bottles of Radithor, which that's a crazy amount of money.
That's a lot of money.
And just like when you think about what that actually means, they said each one of those contains about 1 microcurie of radium, which I was trying to figure out, like, what's the comparison for that? The like microcurie. So they named a unit after Madame Curie or Marie Curie. But I'm pretty sure like the limit of exposure that someone is supposed to have of radium is like under 0.1 microcuries. So a single Radithor beverage was 10 times what the lower limit is for like radium. And he drank like 1,500 throughout his life. So he was well above that. But in any case, he drank it like crazy. 3 years into his radium-fueled bender, he began to complain of jaw pain, neck discomfort, and like these crazy headaches. And so he goes to his physician. He's like, hey, I don't know what's happening. I felt freaking amazing. This stuff is amazing. And all of a sudden, I don't feel that feeling anymore. Instead, I feel like crap. And the dude's like, yeah, you should probably stop drinking that. I would imagine the conversation was more like, oh, you're still drinking that? That was supposed to be for your arm pain, man. Like, had he have stopped, I'm not saying he would have lived forever, but had he had stopped after the arm pain and not just like started downing 3 bottles a day, yeah, he probably wouldn't have died in the way he did. But so it became evident that there were some pretty ill effects that were coming on because of his beloved drink. And he did discontinue it, but by then it was kind of too late. The cocktail of choice, if you will, was ultimately going to kill him, and he knew it. It started by experiencing severe weight loss. Eventually, he began to lose his teeth, all but actually his 2 front teeth. Nice. He began to develop tumors in his jaw, and by 1931, so this is 4 years after his initial introduction, his entire lower jaw and most of his upper jaw, except those 2 front teeth, had to be removed. Which, when I heard that, I was like, what do you mean? How is that possible? There's actually pictures of this that are notorious and infamous, and when I first saw it, I thought it was like fake, or like you were looking at like a war wound or something. It's pretty bad. He looks like a real life zombie. And I don't know if we can like put that anywhere for people to see. If you want, viewer discretion is advised. Let's put it that way. There's actually a progression. There was one picture taken when they took off a part of his lower jaw, and then later it was like his entire essentially lower half
Is that
of his
the one?
face. Yeah, that's the latter one. There's
It's crazy
this
how
is the
he's still
before.
alive at that.
I mean,
It's
that
like,
doesn't
how
even
do
look real, dude. And like, look at his eyes. He's like dead inside.
It's like looking somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I wish, if I was him, I think I'd probably wish I was dead. I mean, that is bad enough, right? But yeah, so he was in pretty bad health. He was actually at that time called upon by, I want to say some government, it might have been Congress, to like talk about his experience with radium because they were becoming aware of like the potential harmful effects. But he was like too sick to even go.
Yeah, it's always like 10 years later.
Yeah, and so unfortunately, essentially, yeah, like I mentioned, he was going through all this. He was having bone fractures because his bones were literally disintegrating. And the reason for that is because radium actually is, when it's absorbed into the body, biologically, it kind of looks similar to calcium. And we've all heard about like calcium being necessary for like strong, healthy bones, right? Well, our bodies confuse radium for calcium and insert it into our bone structures. And therefore, no wonder why you get bone cancer, right? It's like literally shooting radiation into your bones and also your other organs.
Nonstop.
But yeah, nonstop. So
I wonder how that affects like the structural integrity as well.
well, I'm imagining it destroys it because he started having like bone fractures. So he basically became like the man of glass, like just terrible. He actually even developed holes in his skull, like it ate away his skull. So like pretty fucking terrible shit. On March 31st, 1932, he did eventually die at age 51. His death being attributed to long-term radiation exposure from radium that ultimately led to his bone cancer. And that was the real cause of death, although it's all kind of one and the same when you think about it. So, because he was so exposed, they actually had to bury him in the Pittsburgh cemetery within a lead-lined coffin. And that's not terribly dissimilar to like with like Chernobyl and things like that. These nuclear accidents that happened much later in history. The people involved in that also were, I think, buried in like lead-lined coffins to limit potential exposure. His body was actually exhumed in 1965 by an MIT scientist named Robley Evans, and he was kind of looking to see like, is his body just as radioactive as it was, or has it diminished over time? And he also wanted to determine like, can I back calculate like how much he actually ingested over his lifetime? And so he did tests on his remains, and he calculated that Byers had ingested at least the equivalent amount of radium that provides 1,000 microcuries of radiation. So that's a lot more than what is recommended. Projected that he ingested over
1,000 microcuries or a curie?
Yeah.
Okay.
It projected that he ingested well over 3 times the lethal dose of radium during his lifetime. And his body is projected to remain radioactive for several thousand years, as the half-life of radium is on the order of like 1,600 years of that isotope. But so he met kind of a cruel and unusual fate.
So this is interesting. So to talk a little bit more about the microcurie, it's a unit of radioactivity, but it's kind of difficult to comprehend. So they've made a new unit called a becquerel. Anyways, 1 becquerel is an SI unit for radioactivity. It equals 1 disintegration per second. So 1 disintegration meaning that an atom of radium disintegrates, releasing radiation.
Yeah.
So 1 microcurie is 37,000
Jesus
atoms
Christ.
disintegrating per second.
Yeah.
And he had 1,000 of them.
So that's like a lot.
37 million.
Yeah.
37 million atoms disintegrating in your body, releasing radiation.
Yeah. per second.
If the math is right.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is Chat GPT 4.
Sure. Either way, it's very clear, like, he wasn't getting out of there alive. Not at that point. So his death made national headlines, as did an infamous picture that you just saw. Prior to his death, shows a very gruesome deterioration of his jaw. Like I said, it's basically like looking like a fucking zombie movie.
Yeah. The Walking Dead.
Yeah, I honestly thought it was like a Walking Dead, like taken in black and white photo. Like, that's what it looked like. Following his death, and this is also kind of happening at the same time as the ongoing court cases associated with the Radium Girls, awareness for radium's negative health implications led to, again, as we mentioned, the diminishment of radium in everyday products, medicine. It was determined that, as I mentioned, that the main mechanism was because radium looks like calcium is incorporated into bone. So basically, all avenues are pointing towards radium not so good.
No.
Right. Following World War II, the use of radioactive materials in general became much more restricted, and oversight of the government led to regulation not of just radium, but other things like uranium, thorium, etc. In the mid-20th century. By this time, acute and long-term effects of radioactive exposure were becoming more evident, particularly in the years following the use of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan to end World War II. Surprisingly, however, some use of radioactive materials, including radium, thorium, and uranium, did persist in the mainstream culture well into the second half of the century. Thorium had been used, I didn't know this, in gas lanterns and lamps, even some glassware. Thorium, I'm not sure how relatively radioactive it is, but it's still pretty radioactive. It was also applied in construction, within welding rods used for metalworking. Even more recently, small amounts of thorium were also used in early versions of color TVs and computer monitors. So if you got any of those hanging around, don't go busting them open, because who knows what's inside. There's actually a reason why we're supposed to like bring those things to very specific areas to get rid of them. And I think that's one of the reasons. But uranium, this one was a weird one, because we know uranium is often used in like explosives, right? Or for other...
Well, like nuclear fission.
Yeah. Other nuclear processes. So I feel like uranium is actually more known in the like layman's terminology than probably radium. But so uranium had also been used for coloration of ceramics, including like bowls, plates, and other household items, because it provides a vibrant yellow-orange colored paint. And so this practice of using uranium to color these ceramics actually continued all the way in the 1970s, despite the known radioactive properties. So there's like somewhere out there where people are eating dinner off of radioactive plates, which I can't even imagine that. Like, hopefully that wasn't my dad's household.
Yeah, but it's crazy because the cancer rates have just been increasing, even though that has not been a
yeah. I mean, like,
so what's going on?
Clearly it's not the radioactive plates, but my God, like, this is like in the 1970s. This is 40 years after they figured out that shit's all bad for you, and they're still going to do that. That's crazy. Obviously, to this day, there are many applications of radioactive materials, although most are well known and regulated, such as their use in modern weaponry, nuclear power plants, and other things. Despite their toxic effects, radioactive elements are still employed for limited medical applications, but we've come a long way in mitigating potential toxic exposures, patients and doctors alike. But if you think that the debate over the beneficial effects of radiation exposure is long forgotten, a delusion of the past, nope. As we mentioned, despite decades of like experimentation, which has led us to understanding that much of the damage caused by a biological material is caused by ionizing radiation. And this is another fun fact side note. I think we should cover this at some point. This is the same radiation what we know causes DNA damage, ultimately increasing likelihood of cancer. There was some rabbit holes I fell into talking about famous controversial experimentation from the US government between the 40s and the 70s on their own soldiers, where they're like, we don't really know for sure if radiation is super bad for people, but we're going to do some tests. There's like a whole bunch of different tests on our military personnel, and sometimes they didn't tell them about it. They just were like, hey, go stand over here as we drop this like nuclear bomb. Other times they would literally inject them with like radioactive material and just see what happened. Crazy. Despite all this, and they actually did see in those experiments that like it's bad, okay? Like ionizing radiation usually causes cancer. It's not great. There has been a reemergence of an idea I was reading about and kind of telling you about, that ionization or ionizing radiation may not all be bad. So there's this idea called radiation hormesis. It's a theory that has emerged as recently as 2009. Hypothesizes that low doses of ionizing radiation may actually be beneficial due to mechanisms of stimulating the activation of natural biological repair mechanisms. It is thought that due to this stimulation, which isn't normally present without the ionizing radiation, this can actually like stimulate an enhanced immune system that prevents disease, which is kind of an interesting idea. Like, I understand the concept. Like, I'm not saying I've read any of the papers, but like that's a cool idea. Sounds kind of out there. Overall, it's proposed that stimulating in such a manner may lead to enhanced immune system and increased longevity. I'll note that these assertions remain very controversial within the greater scientific community. The general consensus among, most scientists, as well as like regulatory bodies for this kind of thing, so the International Commission on Radiological Protection, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, they all use what's called the linear no threshold model, which is to say that radiation exposure is all bad and it gets worse in a linear fashion the more you have. That's what we're working under. And of course, we're talking about ionizing radiation. Other forms of radiation are kind of up for debate.
Right, yeah, you always hear about you get a ton of radiation on airplanes.
Yeah, or like ionizing radiation from people being in space, I found out is a really big one because you don't have any protection from the atmosphere or the sun. But
yeah, it's an interesting concept.
But like there's other forms of non-ionizing radiation that we're around all the time, from our cell phones, from our computers. There's like the hot topic of 5G, like whether Wi-Fi, 5G, all this stuff is actually like fucking us up, which is a whole nother thing I'm really curious about. But these people are basically saying like, okay, we're not talking about like a large dose. We're talking about like the most minuscule of ionizing radiation could be good for you. And it's like, okay,
just take a small hit, bro.
Yeah, right. Right, like just do ionizing radiation with me, bro. The EPA and all those like agencies are like, nah, man, that's not a good idea. They argue that there's insufficient evidence to support this hypothesis, and that any potential benefits of low dose radiation exposure are very much outweighed by the potential negative risks. And I'm like, I kind of agree with you on that. Don't sign me up for that one.
No.
And so kind of like, I guess in closing, overall, one thing is clear, that the use of radioactive elements, particularly radium in large quantities, is not great. It's really bad for your health. Don't do that. This is not medical advice. we can certainly learn from these like misguided mistakes of the past, as well as also the ill-intentioned and predatory manipulation of these unethical capitalists, which unfortunately happens to the current day. We can apply these kind of lessons to dilemmas we face in the modern age. People aren't going around trying to sell you like radioactive tonics and toothpaste anymore, but we do live in a time, as I mentioned earlier, where there's still some similarities.
They'll sell you a rhino horn.
Yeah, they'll sell you just about anything. There's everywhere you look, there's like a new advertisement of the greatest, newest health fad. From diets to supplements, health trends. We're like completely inundated by this, and I see it because I look it up myself, and then like there's a feedback loop on like Facebook, social media, and stuff where it like just like, oh, have you heard like Ken Griffey Jr. today is now the spokesperson for this dad bod stuff. It's gonna allow you to get rid of all that extra dad bod fat. And I'm just like, I've taken some supplements in the past. They kind of mess me up. Not all, but there are some that I think like if you look at them from a more objective eye, I take, and they have benefited me. But a lot of it is just like, I think, a pure money grab.
Yeah.
And there aren't scientists in the background, despite everything they say, that are truly vetting this.
Lab tested.
Yeah, scientist approved,
Scientist in
like,
the garage.
yeah. Who is the scientist though? Like, and he's probably getting paid by you.
No, the dude that's selling it is the scientist, and he just claims that he's a scientist.
Yeah. Well, and like, kind of, actually, I forgot to mention this. So we discussed how like doctors in nowadays they get like incentivized.
Yeah.
Right. So that doctor CC Moyer, who gave the Radithor to our buddy Eben, which ultimately killed him. William Bailey, the guy who made Radithor, he said he would give 1/7 of the profits back to the doctor that prescribed his Radithor.
Dang,
so it's like,
that's pretty good.
18% or something like that. So like, there was definitely some corrupt doctors back there that were like, yeah, I read the literature on this. Here you go, drink up. So just because it happened way back then, it doesn't mean it's not happening now, and vice versa. Like, it's not a new problem. But anyhow, yeah, it's just like, I guess this kind of reiterates the fact that not much has changed. It's just changed form, right? If something seems like too good to be true, or like some miracle thing, it probably is, and I've been a victim of that. I think everyone probably has at some level or not.
Yeah, we're all suckers for something.
Yeah, we want that like get healthy quick thing, just like the get rich quick thing, but it's more complicated than that. So, I mean, overall, I think Byers' story as well as the Radium Girls are kind of cautionary tales to encourage us to remain skeptical of quick health fixes. And there is ongoing work, and while it's controversial, maybe small amounts of ionizing radiation is beneficial, but I'm not just going to blatantly trust that, without vetting the hypothesis and
test it.
Yeah, it needs to go further. If you just like believed in that, you'd be just as irresponsible as like Bayer was by drinking bottles of that shit per day, So, perhaps those proponents of radiation hormesis are onto something, but until like the compelling evidence comes out, this is actually maybe one example where I do kind of trust the mainstream science. I'm like, I'm not gonna just like take a whim and
right. Well, I mean,
douse myself with radiation.
Decades of radiation.
Yeah,
science.
It's well vetted.
It's not something brand new that came out after a year or two of making it.
Yeah. So I don't know. I thought that was a really like interesting kind of tale.
Booster.
Yeah, a booster. We've been boosted. But I don't know. I think it would be fun to do kind of some of these more like one-off examples. maybe come back to some of the things that we even allude to here.
Yeah, just wild stories that you probably haven't really heard of, but show human nature, and especially if you're like feeling good after taking this drink.
Right.
Wasn't that during like Prohibition too? So maybe you didn't even have alcohol.
Yeah, it was
so
like
just getting drunk on
late
radium.
days of Prohibition. Hey man, you guys fix one way or another, but my God, cost them, right? I don't know. I'd hate to be like. Remember, I was talking about like the World War II guys that had the little coin. I'm like, I wonder if. What if your like grandpa had an heirloom or something that's just like chilling in your he wouldn't know, and then all of a sudden you're like, I've heard of stories like that where people like
this was during the heyday of Prohibition, 1920 to 1933.
Yeah, so that
he didn't have anything else to drink. He got off the whiskey and got on the Radithor.
He got on that Radithor, like sign me up. Maybe like one Radithor drink, you know. Maybe I would try it.
Maybe not 1,000.
They actually they found a couple bottles of like, it was mostly empty, but they did like tests on it and stuff.
Oh really? So they had
more recently, yeah, and it was still like unbelievably radioactive, because I mean the half-life is just insane. But I don't know, radiation kind of is like terrifying in general. We don't have to keep talking about this, but yeah, you can't see it. You can't really even know it's happening till it's like too late. So I mean, unless it's like a mushroom cloud, you'll see that, but you'll probably feel the blast before the radiation kills you. So.
You probably won't feel a thing.
Run towards the fire.
Right. All right.
Well, you have any closing remarks?
I just appreciate y'all tuning in, and I hope you learned something new and interesting you haven't heard before. I think people have talked about the Radium Girls, but not necessarily delve deep into radium as deep as we did.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're a pretty fascinating story. There's actually like a couple movies and documentaries about them. I haven't personally seen them. I did read up on them, and again, I think they're just as tragic, if not more tragic, than obviously rich man Eben. But it's kind of a dark time in history in that regard. So yeah. Good things did come out of it, though, like certain regulations and protections. So, yeah, they. It's kind of hard to say, but they didn't die in vain, I guess you would say. Like, their death meant something. They fought for it. They made a sacrifice.
Yeah, there's good things that came out of it.
They just didn't know they were doing it at the time they were doing it.
Yeah.
But, yeah, don't go putting paint on your face, though. Even if it's not radium lace, it's probably not a good idea, unless it is like legitimate face paint. But
even
like,
still, though,
yeah, who knows what we're gonna find out in like 20 years. But anyways, this has been the Ballad of Eben Byers plus radium. Don't drink that Radithor.
Trust the science.
Trust the science.